Well, good afternoon and welcome to another FS Club webinar based here largely in London. And I'm delighted to have with me Lord Toby Harris. Toby is chairman of the National Preparedness Commission, and it has been a delight over the last year and a bit to have had the opportunity to work with Tony and to see how dedicated he is to getting the nation to think about preparing for the unthinkable and the uncertain. And I think given events that we've all seen over the last few years, that's certainly something we should constantly have on our minds. I'd like to say, you'll know me, I'm Michael Mainelli. I'm one of the directors of the CN Group, and it really is a privilege to be able to introduce so many of these webinars. And we can only do so because of the generosity and, dare I say, tolerance of our sponsors. And today, as we're looking at very much the idea of, don't think about elephants or think about the unthinkable, it's going to be a bit challenging, but I think all of our sponsors are very much in the mindset of people who are looking across technology, economics, and finance, and trying to think, where's the world going and how can we make it a better place? Now, as we turn to today's session, we're going to follow a fairly traditional FS Club format. My job is to get out of the way as quickly as possible and to let you hear from our expert, Lord Harris. We did have a little bit of thinking the unthinkable in that my machinery here had collapsed. I'm currently on an emergency system, so you may see me switch in the background and join later during Toby's presentation. But Toby has very kindly agreed to take questions, and so we've got approximately 20 minutes for questions and answers. And so three things, if I may. Firstly, please do use the GoToWebinar Q&A facility that allows us to bring your questions in and to feed them into a conversation with Toby. Secondly, yes, this is being recorded, and the recording will be available in about 2 working days, so probably Wednesday afternoon. And 3, yes, the slides are also available. So it's going to be a full-on session, and it should be a lot of fun, because what Toby's talking about is absolutely important for all of us individually, but also for the nation. So Toby, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Michael. So the most overused ancient Chinese curse, and I have to admit, actually, it's the only one I know, is may you live in interesting times. So here we are. Certainly 2020 and 2021 were interesting and not what any of us expected. In the early weeks of 2020, when reports of a flu-like illness in Wuhan were first reported by the World Health Organization, few would have anticipated the scale of what was about to unfold. Certainly the speed with which the norms of society unraveled, with deserted city centres, businesses shut down, enforced social distancing and mask wearing, came as a shock to many. However, we should have been ready. Epidemics have occurred traumatically throughout history, and pandemic flu has been in the top tier of the UK's National Risk Register since it was first published a decade ago. So far, 2022 has brought us the war in Ukraine and near double-digit inflation. We're only just into April. Next slide. Now, some of you will remember the Monty Python sketch, No One Expected the Spanish Inquisition. Well, I suspect in 1450 BC, there were not many people who predicted the destruction of the Minoan civilization as a result of a volcanic eruption. Nor in the mid-1300s AD were there many people expecting the impact on European civilization of the Black Death. Likewise, there were not many voices 21 years ago who were being heard predicting the events of 11th September 2001. And similarly, the speed of the banking crisis 13 years ago was predicted more with the benefit of hindsight. Next slide. Now, the National Preparedness Commission was conceived before COVID hit. But the last year has highlighted how its central purpose to promote better preparedness in the UK for a major crisis or incident has become. Next slide. The Commission brings together 46 leading figures from public life, academia, business and civil society. At that first meeting 16 months ago, Commissioners were warned that, irrespective of COVID, we are living in a world that is increasingly volatile and unstable. Indeed, a month later, a new edition of the National Risk Register was quietly published on the gov.uk website. This mapped 38 major risks facing the country, including environmental hazards, major accidents, malicious attacks, cyber-based and terrorist, risks arising overseas, and inevitably animal and human diseases. The National Preparedness Commission has in essence, therefore, to focus on three questions. What should we prepare for? How much preparedness is enough? And how do we finance the necessary investment? Now, these are not just questions for national government, and there is a welcome recognition of this in last year's integrated review. Next slide. Most of the public discussion of that review focused on the defence and foreign policy content, much of which is already out of date. But in my view, one of the most important sections was Chapter 4, Building Resilience at Home and Abroad. This explicitly promised a comprehensive national resilience strategy based on a whole of society approach involving individuals, businesses and organisations. Indeed, as the Commission has been saying since it was established, making every level of government, every organisation and every community more resilient can create a sort of herd immunity for a society better able to address future global crises, whether it's a new pandemic or a massive cyber attack or climate change. And this is also true for each household and every individual. We all have to play our part. Genuinely, as somebody once said, we're all in it together. So, if you don't mind, I'd like to do a little test. How well are each of you on this call prepared in your own homes? So, first question. Who has a powerful working torch? By which I mean one that has not been borrowed by children or grandchildren and left on under a bed. Vote now. Right, you're all pretty good on that. Question 2. Who has a wind-up radio? Vote now. Already it's a problem. Okay, final question. How many of you have enough bottled water at home to sustain your household for a week? That's 2 litres per person per day. Vote now. Actually, this is slightly better than the wind-up radio. That's quite interesting. Next slide. There are, of course, a series of global trends that are likely to impact directly or indirectly on all of us in the coming years. First and foremost is climate change. This is leading to more extreme weather events, both at home and abroad. Floods, droughts, storms, heat waves, and heavy rainfall will become more intense and more frequent. This will mean that some parts of the world will become increasingly uninhabitable, driving huge movements of refugees and leading to shortages of food and water with an impact on global supply chains and producing political instability that will spill over national borders. Second, the world can expect increased competition for natural resources with greater supply insecurities, and we're already seeing that in terms of competition for rare earth minerals and so on. And this is in the context of a changing world order and rapid geopolitical change, with the US surrendering its preeminence, China becoming an increasingly dominant economic power, and Russia using, as we're seeing, both kinetic and hybrid means to maximize its influence, and perhaps with the future of the European Union becoming less certain. And just over a year ago, we had the Texas power failure. Now, that was an illustration of vulnerability in a modern, highly industrialized nation. And that highlighted First, the failure to invest adequately in the maintenance of critical infrastructure. Second, the reliance on ever more complex and interconnected systems. And third, the dangers of cascade collapse. Such vulnerabilities exist around the world, and as in Texas, no one entity is responsible for mitigating them. So, some crises will arise suddenly and unexpectedly, requiring urgent action. Others will develop over decades. So the world is increasingly volatile and unstable. One thing we should learn from the last 2 years is that we cannot go on burying our heads in the sand. We need to be better prepared for the unexpected. And the lesson for all of us, the overriding lesson in every country, is that we have probably not been investing sufficiently in our preparedness and resilience. Next slide. So in essence, we have to try and predict the unpredictable. We have to prepare for the uncertain, and recognize that some of it will be wrong. And what makes that all the more difficult is that our minds tend to be programmed in ways that make it hard to respond to novel risks and to protracted and complex challenges. We find it easier to believe that something might happen if it comes easily to mind. The more we can picture it, the higher our intuitive estimate of its likelihood. Then there is optimism bias, predisposing us to be over-optimistic about the risk of something bad happening and overconfident about our ability to cope if it does. At worst, this can result in outright denial. And of course, it's harder to form sound judgments about how much effort is to invest in preventing low likelihood but very high impact risks. And we're also subject to confirmation bias, that universal tendency to pay attention to what supports our existing beliefs while ignoring information that contradicts them. I think that's Michael coming in somewhere, yeah. And groupthink, the inclination to follow the pack and conform to the majority view. And finally, there is NIMTO, not in my term of office. Being properly prepared and resilient is expensive. Adopting a preparedness philosophy means parking our just-in-time approach in favor of just in case, being ready to build in redundancy and being ready to avoid interdependency. Now, this is bad enough in the public sector, but is also bad in the corporate sector, particularly in a world with increasing focus on annual returns and quarterly figures. So, I am a recovering politician. I know how difficult it is for our elected leaders to devote resources, by which I mean the public's tax contributions, to projects that do not come to fruition by the time of the next election, or perhaps even the one after it. How difficult it is to build resilience that is probably invisible and may never be needed for an eventuality that may not happen. It's much nicer to be able to open big, new, shiny things rather than to invest in making sure that the things you have don't fall apart. And it's usually impossible to prove that your actions have prevented something happening, particularly if that hypothetical event is at some indeterminate time in the future and almost certainly long after your term of office is forgotten. Next slide. That is why Mayor Kotuko Wamura of Fudai in Japan is such a rare exception. He served as mayor for 40 years. He was re-elected 9 times. But beginning in 1972, he was ridiculed for insisting on building 51-foot high floodgates and a huge 673-foot sea wall at a cost of around $30 million. He was vindicated by the tsunami of 2011 that obliterated other nearby towns, but not Fudai. 3,000 residents owed their lives to his foresight, but he was by then long dead, and his only thanks were the many flowers laid on his grave. So to be resilient and prepared, we need to scan the horizon. what's out there but not yet looming. If you like, Elijah's cloud no bigger than a man's hand. And we've got to look out for Rumsfeld's unknown unknowns. And we've got to have plans to prepare and build general resilience. And that's where the National Preparedness Commission comes in. Next slide. Since our first meeting in November 2020, we published 10 reports and held a series of roundtables involving commissioners, civil servants and subject matter experts, along with a number of more general external-facing open events. For example, we've just published a major review of the Civil Contingencies Act and its supporting arrangements. This makes 117 recommendations to strengthen resilience arrangements at local, regional and national levels, to build links with the voluntary and community sector, and for more and better information to enable families from better information to enable families, businesses and communities to be better prepared. Another paper, Partnering with Purpose, looks at how the government can create a climate in which businesses and the private sector generally are enabled and supported to be better prepared and more resilient. This also talks about providing better information about the threats that the nation faces, but also looks at how the regulatory framework might better encourage resilient behaviour. And then there's the paper that you, Michael, authored with a little bit of input from me on how the insurance sector might drive better resilience. But the message from all of these is we've got to get beyond simply admiring the scale of what we face, whether it's climate change, a pandemic even more serious than COVID, a devastating cyber attack, or whatever else it might be. Often the responses needed are threat neutral. The steps necessary are the same, whatever the hazard. Think back to the beginning of the pandemic and the need to identify and support vulnerable people isolated in their homes. The problems of utilities sharing information with the NHS and vice versa. The perceived concerns about GDPR and confidentiality. I think it was last week, the Commission held a round table looking at how those issues were overcome and could be overcome in the future. Because the need to identify and support vulnerable people, vulnerable individuals arises in a pandemic, in a flood, or virtually every other sort of emergency. Next slide. I rather like the taxonomy, which says we have to be ready not only for the black swans, previously unobserved, high impact, hard to predict rare events, but also the black jellyfishes, things we think we know about and understand, but which turn out to be more complex and uncertain, sometimes with a long tail and a nasty sting at the end. And finally, the black elephants, challenges visible to everyone, but which no one wants to deal with. The message is resilience needs to be designed in and part of society's fabric. And the increasing complexity of our society and its systems, of course it brings many benefits, but it potentially creates its own fragilities. Next slide. Let me give you one example. At 1654, on the 9th of August 2019, there was a simultaneous loss of one gas and one offshore generator. And despite the backup arrangements, the temporary reduction in frequency led to a power cut in some areas of the country. The grid stabilized within 15 minutes and all demand was reconnected in all areas by 1740. Now that outage was caused by two completely unconnected random events that produced a modest cascade effect. The electricity grid did what it was expected to do, and power was restored extremely quickly, within 45 minutes. There were, of course, consequences. Nearly 1 million people were without power, but not for long. Newcastle Airport was plunged into darkness for 15 minutes. Ipswich hospital was hit by a 30-minute power cut because the emergency generator had failed, with patients trapped in lifts, interruptions to supply in the cardiac units, and so on. In fact, someone in the government saw it as a point for congratulation that the emergency generators had failed in only one hospital. In Bradford, London, and other areas, the traffic lights failed, leading one transport cop to say it's like Grand Theft Auto out there. So those were the immediate consequences during that 45 minutes. The most prolonged effects were on the rail system. Major delays lasted through the night. Some of you may have been involved. The reason? Electric trains are designed, quite appropriately, to come gently to a halt if the power fails. And those systems worked. Trains stopped in their place all over the network. The problems arose because some classes of those trains could only be rebooted by the physical presence of an engineer who had to travel to the affected trains, and where trains had stopped, other trains could not pass them, spreading the disruption to unaffected trains that could have been restarted by the drivers. Now, my point is not to apportion blame in this case, but to highlight the fact that there will be interdependencies that have not been considered. Nor indeed may it be clear who should be responsible for managing a particular consequence. Is it the electricity generator that failed, the grid itself, the train operator, or the train designer? I started with a reference to a Chinese curse, but there's another Chinese saying that is also relevant. Gain wisdom from the experience of setbacks. It is, of course, a truism that generals always prepare to fight the last war rather than the one that is actually coming. Sir David Omand, the former UK security coordinator, recast it in a slightly different way. He said, what we prepare for, we deter. So what we actually experience by way of events is, alas, what we have not prepared for. The reality is that our nations, our cities and communities and our organizations have to have preparedness and resilience designed in. It has to be part of society's fabric. Ultimately, it means that every single one of us have to see preparedness and resilience as our responsibility, just as much as it is the responsibility of public authorities. There is always the assumption that someone else will sort it out. Next slide. Be prepared was, of course, Lord Baden-Powell's motto for the Scout movement, so that automatically and instinctively you did the right thing at the right moment. But I'm not sure that the 1908 edition of Scouting for Boys or the 1912 version for girls, How Girls Can Help Build Up the Empire, had in mind the sort of emergencies we face today. But the principle was absolutely sound. We all need to be resilient. We all need to prepare for risks. And of course, it's not cost-free. Next slide. It may not be cost-free, but not doing so is worse. Or, as John F. Kennedy put it, there are risks and costs to action, but they are far less than the long-range costs of comfortable inaction. Thank you.
Well, Toby, thank you very much for a great exposition of the challenges that we face. And we've got quite a few questions here and comments. So I'll just leap in if I may. There's one from Derek Scott pointing to, and this may be an opportunity for you to explain a little bit more about what the commissioners do. Are 46 commissioners far too many for clear decision making or leadership?
Well, we're not trying to provide decisions or leadership. What we're trying to do is make sure that the nation as a whole takes preparedness and resilience much more seriously. The 46 are all preeminent in their fields. They're all very busy people. I never thought I'd get more than a third of them in the room at the same time. Actually, they're all so committed to this that we usually do substantially better than that. What we want to do is to provide a steady flow of policy ideas, action ideas, which can influence government influence organizations so as to enable us to our general objective of raising national preparedness and resilience. So that's what we started to do, and that's what we're intending to continue to do.
Michael Crichton wrote a book nearly 20 years ago called State of Fear, and he said that people in a position such as yours, NGOs, university departments, really are out there to scaremonger, to raise funds and do things. And before you think I'm about to have a go, I'm not. Last month, you published a report which said that London had made significant progress against terrorism, which I thought was a very positive and uplifting report. And it garnered quite a bit of praise. And Sadiq Khan used it obviously to make a plea for a bit more money too, but that's fair enough. But then we also had a report done just before the pandemic, claiming that both the UK and the US were the two most prepared nations for that. So how much credibility can we put into these types of reports about our preparedness?
Well, I'd like to think the report I did, which relied on sort of interviewing several hundred people and in-depth look at all our systems, does provide some reassurance. However, having said that, having offered the reassurance, that's fairly heavily caveated. Firstly, one of the things I looked at was how quickly does an armed response unit arrive at a terrorist incident? Now, actually, the figures, and I looked at both the figures for actual events and then the figures for occasions when armed response was triggered in other occasions, are pretty good. So an armed response unit arriving in 3, 4, 5 minutes is actually, when you think of London and its complexities, good. But if you're in the middle of an incident with a terrorist or terrorists armed with knives, machetes, or worse still, automatic weapons, that's an eternity. So how much protection you need is a real concern. Secondly, things change all the time. You've got to be ready to react to events which may be anywhere in the world, because all these things move very quickly thanks to the internet. So a technique found in Syria or conceivably the Ukraine, it can be used in this country within a matter of minutes or days. So there is that need to respond. But I think the thing about the measures of our COVID preparedness before the COVID struck was, of course, they were looking at pandemic flu. COVID isn't pandemic flu. It has different requirements for protective equipment, for masks and so on. Crucially, it spreads it can spread with asymptomatic carriers. So that was different. The trouble was the assumptions that had been built in this country and many others about an unknown form of a virus reaching us were that it might happen. The National Risk Register said it could happen. It was a moderate risk, but it would probably involve no more than 100 or 200 people getting the disease in the first place. Now, we know how wrong that was. So first of all, these risks have to be kept under constant review. Secondly, you should be working on the basis of, well, what else should we be doing? What else could happen? How do we respond to it? And I think the message from the Commission is, look, there are some common things that you need to be able to do, some common things that you should be doing. Let's have those in the back pocket. You won't be able to predict the precise event, but let's make sure that you've got the various building blocks in place.
Wow, well, we got a couple of fun comments here. As an Eagle Scout myself, Hugh Purser points out that the Scouts Code actually bears a remarkable similarity to the Bushido Code of the samurai in Japan, so that kind of military preparedness, ability to adapt and respond. And on the other hand, Stephen Murgatroyd wonders how many people here have seen the movie Don't Look Up, which was a satire on an asteroid hitting the planet and everybody too busy in their social media to do much about it. So we sort of see those extremes and we laugh. But you made a point that this isn't cost-free, Toby. And I could spend an infinite amount, couldn't I? Being prepared in a sort of a world, Victor, for those of you who are science fiction fans, very much like Larry Niven's Ring World, where the puppeteers will spend an infinite amount to avoid any damage. How do we set that amount? You know, how much should we be spending on resilience?
I think the worrying thing is we don't know. We don't even know if we're spending it consistently. When I look at the National Risk Register, fairly patchily, there are 38 broad categories of risk, and I'm not even sure those are the right 38 categories, because the methodology, even the government admit the methodology is not very good and needs to be revised, and they're going through that process at the moment. Some of those 38 risks, they list some mitigations. For example, I can't quite remember the figures. I think it's either we're due to spend £6 billion over 5 years or £5 billion over 6 years on flood defences to mitigate the risks of flooding. Fine. Why £5 or £6 billion? Where's that being spent? Which floods are you mitigating as opposed to those that occur elsewhere? And how does that £5 or £6 billion compare with the money you spend on mitigating the threats of terrorism, or the amount of money you spend mitigating infectious diseases, or indeed chronic diseases and recurrent chronic diseases? These are things that I don't think we've thought enough about. And as you also say, how much is enough? I gave the example of how long do you wait before the armed response unit arrives? Well, you could make that quicker. I suspect you'd have to, if you wanted to halve the average response time, you'd probably have to quadruple or even more the amount of money you spend on armed officers. And let's forget whether or not you could get enough people trained and available and ready to do the job. But at what point do you say, actually, we've now sacrificed the look and feel of our city to such an extent that this is not viable? So these ultimately are political judgments. But as I speak as a recovering politician, unless there's some public debate and some public understanding of these issues, then you're not going to get the right judgments. It's too easy to go for the things which look popular, look good, and ignore those that may never be needed or where there isn't the same visibility.
Well, as a recovering politician, I'm going to throw you this question, but you might want to duck it, but I just think it's interesting. It's from Jonathan Soar. In the context of everything you said, Toby, how prepared do you think the Ukrainians were for the Russian invasion?
Well, you have to hand it to them. They have responded remarkably under the circumstances. I think, and this is true if you look at every nation which faces some sort of existential threat, they are much better prepared than we are, because the existential threat is visible and real. You go to Israel. I spent a time looking at their homeland security arrangements. I'm not getting in an argument as to whether what they do is proportionate or right in any set of circumstances, but I'm talking about that is because that as a country feels potentially under existential threat all the time. You go to Estonia, or you go to some of the other countries who feel under threat from Russia, and they have invested far more in their preparedness and readiness. Estonia, after facing some very nasty cyber attacks, is now one of the best prepared, in terms of cyber, best prepared nations in the world. So it's a question of recognizing those risks. One of the things I think we want to do at the Preparedness Commission is say, well, it's not necessarily the threat of invasion, or it's not necessarily, there are all sorts of other things that could completely disrupt our way of life. We discovered that with COVID. But in fact, if about 5 or 6 years ago, the US Department of Defense said that in an unclassified report that the US electricity grid had been penetrated so effectively by both the Russians and the Chinese that either the Russians or Chinese could switch it off at will. So I thought, well, this is interesting. So I asked some questions in this country. Do we think the same is true here? Well, I didn't get a proper answer, but ultimately the nearest I got to it was, well, we don't think they would at the moment. Well, actually, if the electricity system went off, everything stops. So it's about thinking there are things out there. What's our plan B? How do we manage? How do we cope with that? And, you know, I've been in things when we talked about power failures, and you people go, oh, we've got a plan. Where do you keep the plan? Oh, we've got it in the cloud. Anybody can access it. Yeah, what if you can't access the cloud because the power's off? Or we've got an emergency generator in the basement. Wonderful. So what if what's caused the problem is a flood? Because your emergency generator is not going to help you if it's in the basement under those circumstances.
Mm, mm. We've got a few other comments here. You know, Robert Woodthorpe Brown just spoke with a Ukrainian friend who's full of the praise for the UK in terms of sending arms. They have the people, they need the arms. So preparedness, at least at that level, was sort of slightly different. Rupert Stubbs is curious about how much you might agree with Nicholas Taleb's fooled by randomness, and also his discussions about fragility and the precautionary principle, which has always been this sort of point. But I'd like to focus maybe on two areas. The first one is the role of localism. There's a great question here from Hugh Purser. You spoke of preparing at household and individual level, and loved your three questions about the radio, you know, the rainwater and the torches. But might this lead to a home is my castle mindset, so that perhaps we don't care for people really outside our local neighborhood? Or might that argue that a local community-based focus should be the priority?
Well, I'm not advocating we go into full-scale survivalist mode. I mean, I could have asked some other questions like how many tins of sardines do you have, and do you have a fully topped up first aid kit, which has, you know, which you've replenished when you've used some of the more common items. I think what I'm trying to say is this should be preparedness at every level. So national government should be prepared. Big utilities, the big corporations should be prepared. Smaller businesses need to think about this. Local authorities need to think about it. All the different elements of society need to think about what they need to do. And we've also got to bear in mind our responsibility to everybody else. What is our responsibility to our community? So if you think about your business, of course, you're interested in your own survival, but to what extent do you factor in, yeah, and I'm essential to that business, that business, that business, and I need to think about them and how I provide my core support to them. Similarly, you hope that there are other businesses on whom you rely are also thinking about how they're going to maintain their continuity to you of your raw materials or your whatever else it may be that you rely on from them. So there is a corporate wisdom. All of this is about raising the mindset. This is my responsibility as well as somebody else's. I think we often think, oh, this is so difficult, somebody will come and sort it out. Well, yeah, but we've got to start with our own contribution to that. We've also got to see what else we can do for those around us, including our neighbours.
Now, Mike Clark is curious, would you support the proposition that the UK government has for many years delegated too much societal risk management to companies in the capital markets, and the markets aren't really designed to handle these large societal risks?
I think the markets aren't designed to handle this because, first of all, it's a question you posed right at the beginning. I think we haven't got a proper system of valuing resilience and preparedness. We can't say easily, well, actually, this is a provision. We put this aside because it is worth us, to us as the owners of this company or whatever. This is what is the value to us of being resilient and having invested in preparedness and resilience. So the market doesn't necessarily help us and work on that basis. I think government has abrogated responsibility to some considerable extent on these issues, but it's more because they just haven't got round to thinking about it, or they haven't worked through how they would respond, or they've responded in a piecemeal fashion. One of the biggest failings of our arrangements are that we don't think systemically. We don't look at the interconnectedness. We don't think at what the secondary order consequences might be, or what else is dependent on it. I can give you some examples, but it looks as though you've got other questions you want to put.
Yeah, we've got a lot here, and Rushan Lee is focused, I think, on this bit of, where do we draw the line? That I think is the intriguing bit. And Peter Neville Lewis says that everybody should read the article in the FT on the 28th of March about Finland having a plan, 6 decades of national and military preparation, supported by cooperation with business. But just turning back to the numbers, because we have a financial audience here, Mike Clark is wondering, can or should HM Treasury's contingent liability central capability be playing a lot of this role, and is that not a good move?
I do think that central government, whether they like it or not, probably have to be there as the backstop in the last resort. And certainly the public expectation is, hey, you're supposed to be looking after our well-being. We are expecting you to try and sort these things out. So there is definitely a role there for central government. Equally, that should be a shared responsibility. So every part of society should be recognizing we've got to be trying to do some of this as well. And that's where, if you look at the Finnish example, or you look at some of the other examples, you can see why, because they're engaging the whole population, and by the whole population, they're including all of the business community. In Sweden, every household gets a booklet if crisis or war comes, and it has some of the practical advice, but also some very clear messages. For example, if you hear that the government of Sweden has conceded defeat, then this is fake news, ignore it. But I mean, you know, there are some practical things in there as well, and it's about building a recognition that we've all got to play a part in it, and I think that's what's got to come.
Yeah. Now, we have had some good examples. In particular, I think I frequently hold out Pool Re, the terrorism reinsurer, supported by the government, which was an interesting combination of public and private partnership. And since the pandemic, we've had all sorts of things. Lloyd's has proposed a black swan reinsurance. There's been a climate re, which Mike Clark points out again. There's been a TOTUS re, and there's a lot of talk on it. But we've also got some things that don't cost. I mean, a good example is our lack of preparedness for quantum computing breaking current encryption methods. This is a largely costless, just getting people to implement something at the same time across the system. Would the National Preparedness Commission have a role in that type of approach?
I think we've got a role in trying to highlight these issues and make sure that people do look in those terms. Actually, some of you may remember the Y2K concerns, the idea that all the computer systems in the world were going to stop on Millennium Eve. We've actually published a paper on that because the myth has grown up that this was a false alarm. The reality was it was real. Some things did happen on Millennium Eve, but it was the concerted effort over across the world and over quite an extended period to make sure that most systems were Y2K proofed. So the worst examples that people were concerned about didn't happen, but an awful lot of other things might have done. It was because of that intervention at an early stage.
I can only underscore that as having, with two others, created Task Force 2000, and it was a Zen thing. And I would point anybody interested to Martin Thomas's lecture at Gresham College about 3 years ago. He started off as a skeptic and came away convinced that the preparedness for that had been absolutely material in avoiding worse damage, and also pointing out that there were severe damages which were not exactly suppressed, but people just didn't pay attention to. Real loss of life, sadly.
And if you want a summary of it, he's written a paper for the National Preparedness Commission, which is on our website.
Very good then. Well, Martin's an old friend, and I'm pleased he's done it for you. So I just turn, in the time available, one sort of final question, because we could go on and we could discuss resilience and robustness, etc. But I think one of the tensions we have here is you've held out, I believe, almost a lighthouse that we can all agree it needs doing. What are your next steps, and what could this audience be doing with you?
Send money. No, well, actually, that's not a bad conclusion. What we found is that there is a tremendous appetite for the work that we're doing. We feel we're pushing against an open door. I had to appear before the Joint Committee on National Security Strategy and in Parliament, and parliamentarians were asking me, have your people done this? have you got a team working on this? And I was trying to say, look, you know, not quite that you're looking at the team or you're not looking at the organization, but we're very small. What we've done is, by harnessing a great amount of goodwill, I think already achieved a raising of quite a number of issues, but we need to turn that into something which is sustainable. So I'm quite keen to make the organization more sustainable and give us the opportunity to continue to do this on a more systematic basis, because I think we're capable of having a real influence. Government is beginning to listen to some of this stuff. They've committed themselves to producing a national resilience strategy later this year. You may be slightly surprised that we didn't have one before, but we are now going to have one. And making sure that that strategy is effective and keeping it effective is going to be a job, and that has to be a job by the people outside government as well as within government. And I think that's where the Commission could come in. So as much support in kind or financially or anything else, or simply listening, is going to be very important.
Well, Toby, I think sadly we've come to the end of time, but you've definitely drawn and very much from just simply the sheer scale of interest here. People's intention, and I assume to help you and to learn as you move forward. We'd like to perhaps see that as things move along. In particular, I personally think I'd encourage you to poke a little bit harder at where some of these financial instruments could make a difference. And it does sound to me from the conversation today that a lot of the discussion here is, okay, get it, but how much should we spend? You know, a good example of this has been, for example, the Thames barrier, where the government has just simply completely reduced the time frame of the barrier, and hey presto, the problem disappears. But it doesn't disappear. The floods are still a very severe and likely reality that we'll have to face up to. Unfortunately, we seem to only do that when they happen. Anyway, enough of my musings. I'm delighted that you've come. We really do look forward to seeing you again. I had to get up and pick up. I didn't have a wind-up radio. I'm not too sure what I think I have a plan on the water. I definitely have a few torches around the place for sure. But this is my sardines from The Price of Fish. And I'd like to, if I could, thank you on behalf of the audience with our traditional Korean karmic clapper. In a real emergency, this would substitute for applause. We'd like to thank you very much for coming on and hope you come back soon.
Thanks very much.